Uh, we'll get started. And so thank you, everybody who is coming back for our second round of training with Dr. Teresa Laughlin-Boyes out of Stanford University, tenured professor at Stanford University Education Department. And she will be talking about Native American racial ethnic socialization and some on her American Indian life skills. So welcome, Teresa.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I wish I could see all your faces out there. I hope everything's okay with you all. Let me just say I'm happy to be here again. And this is actually the sort of the second session of 3 that we were trying to do on Native American racial socialization and American Indian life skills. So in this set of slides and session, what I want to cover is some on family racial ethnic socialization, school racial ethnic socialization, and then how we might bridge American Indian life skills with school racial ethnic socialization. Last session, we talked a lot about different ethnic identity development models, but this session we're going to move it on into work with racial socialization in families, in schools, and then ways we might think about skills training for racial literacy, and of course, for just all around better psychological well-being. So what I wanted to just kind of start off with is a sense about what we're dealing with in a current context, and why I think Virgil and I think that this is relevant information given what has been happening recently. But for right now, I just want to think about the fact that since 2010 in the United States, we've reached really high levels of ethnic racial diversity and reelected the nation's very first African-American biracial president. And currently, scholars have documented all kinds of ethnic racial inequities in education and this sort of increased xenophobia in the country.
Hey, Teresa. Sorry to interrupt you. Your slideshow, if you want to switch it to presenter view, because it has your notes too on it.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm all out of it.
There we go.
Better. Okay,
all
great.
Right.
So, and I am on, you do have the volume, right?
Yep.
I'm not on mute anymore. Okay, thank you. All right. But basically, I attended a conference a few weeks ago, and Gloria Ladson-Billings, who's the president of the American Academy of Education, talked about that we're really currently going through 4 different pandemics. This is interesting. So why do you see the slides and the presenter view?
Oh, it was how it was. You just switched it back.
I know, but I don't get to see this is interesting. I don't get to see oh, here we go. How's that?
That's good.
Yeah, but I don't get to see my notes. In presenter view, it just doesn't work.
So maybe we just see your notes too. That'd be good.
Oh, that's too bad. Then I don't want you to have to read it all. Interesting. Okay, well, let me see if I can wing it. How about that?
All right.
We'll try that. So we'll go back. Okay. So the pandemics, we all know about the COVID pandemic, and how this has gone, through, basically all over the world. But when we had the anti-Black racism emphasis and protests, they went around the globe. We're probably going to be experiencing, and we are talking about this within the government, about the coming economic collapse, and then the climate catastrophes that are going on globally. And all these things are converging at one time, and I think it's a challenging time for all of us. But I do think that it's a time where we are, where young people in particular are struggling with the challenges that are before us. So I'm going to have to go on to presenter view because I've just got too much good stuff to do that. All right, I'm sorry about that. So to talk about, we're going to talk first about family, racial, ethnic socialization. And I really wanted to do this because I think that I've been very impressed with what I have seen in a number of tribal communities across, the country, but also in Northern California. And so with racial ethnic socialization, we're talking about how families and communities help their children develop their identity and feel a sense of belongingness to their group. And I think undergirding all that is this sense that it's very important for us to have this sense of knowing, our beliefs and preferred behaviors within a particular cultural ethnic group to kind of offset the pressure. There's so much pressure in mainstream society to assimilate to those kinds of norms, and this seems to help offset that somewhat. This is a model, I think it's really a great model about the important role of ethnic racial identity that I talked about last time and ethnic racial socialization that we're discussing today in sort of protecting against the impact of discrimination. So if you look at this lower level, this sort of arrow at the very grounded part of this figure, what you see is that there is an impact. There's a direct relation between racial and ethnic discrimination and psychological adjustment. And through ethnic, and if you think of through this sort of protective cloud, this ethnic identity, racial socialization, cultural orientation, these culturally informed, promotive, and protective factors, that influences then self-concept and attributions and ways we think about things and our coping strategies, which then can sort of break the effect or help, mute some of the effect of the discrimination on adjustment. When we talk about this type of socialization, it's most often studied within psychology with African American youth and families. And we're only just now, probably in the 2000s, the mid 2000s on, thinking much about other cultural groups. But the person that began this work really was Diane Hughes at the University of Michigan, and she, or NYU, I'm sorry, NYU. And she was part of the study of the national, or used data from the National Study of Black Americans to study these socialization practices. And in this study, this National Study of Black Americans, which is at the housed at the University of Michigan, 85% of Dominican, Mexican, and Puerto Rican parents reported that they in fact did practice a form of cultural socialization. 68% of Latina mothers and 68% of Latino fathers say that it was important to talk to their children about culture, but beginning as early as age 4. This is a study by Cabrera and colleagues. And then going back to Hughes's work, we have the fact that 8% of parents and 13% of youth mention messages about racial barriers in response to their questions about being Black. We do know that Native American, US-born Asian and Latino and immigrant families transmit their primary cultural values and beliefs and practices to their children on a daily basis through routines in terms of the language that's spoken at home, if native language is spoken at home, when indigenous foods are served, the cultural traditions are observed. And that's why we think it's very relevant in the case of the work that's being done that all of you are tending to hear with 2 feathers. Cultural socialization, it's slightly different. It's more emphasizing just the cultural part, not so much the racial part. And the purpose of it is to get an orientation to both one's ethnic culture and the mainstream culture. We have found that being engaged in cultural socialization practices is very promotive. It's very positively associated with developmental outcomes, such as self-esteem, racial identity, academic engagement, and well-being. I think it's befitting in doing this presentation to acknowledge the work of Dr. Katja Riesling-Baldi in terms of her scholarship on a very important practice in your area with the flower dance. And her, and her book is outstanding. It's won a number of awards entitled "We Are Dancing for You: Native Feminisms and the Revitalizations of Women's Coming of Age Ceremonies." This slide is really showing some of very interesting cultural socialization practices in terms of some of the ceremonies. And you see here on the right and the left are two photographs of Dene or Navajo young women going through their Canalda ceremony. The one in the middle with a group of people is a naming ceremony. And of course, I added to that, this sculpture of a storyteller, because that's another way through stories that children are socialized to the beliefs of the culture. And of course, cultural socialization is, again, very promotive of positive associations with high ethnic identity, self-esteem, academic adjustment, academic achievement, and adaptive coping. I included this slide here about the canoe journey, which has been, revitalized in the Pacific Northwest, because there's quite a bit of funding of work with through the National Institute of Alcohol and Alcohol Abuse, for looking at the outcomes, positive outcomes of the canoe journey. And there is a reference list that I prepared, to accompany this slides that'll be on the Two Feathers website. And the study by Donovan, if you really are curious about it, you could go to the study by Donovan. It's cited on this slide, and these slides will be posted there as well. That talks about the impact of this on, engagement, and they're hoping that they'll have some good outcomes concerning the reduction in substance use. They're not there yet. They're more at the sort of intermediate part of the impact study of this practice. What's I think so important about this kind of work is it does really convey the community values and beliefs of the members of the community. And it's not only emphasizing the fact that the responsibility of the community is to care for its youth, it's also to say that as we raise people throughout life in sync with these values, that they also have an obligation to be productive members of the community. So it's kind of a reciprocal relationship. So what are some of the sources of that? Really, we're really talking about three things sort of combined: racial socialization, ethnic socialization, and cultural socialization. And we can list a number of sources. It isn't only families, it isn't only parents, it's not only schools, but we can say that families are very influential pretty much up to adolescence. Parent and family beliefs and feelings about their culture are noticeable, even if they're silent. Parents' goals for their children in connection to their community, the teaching of respect for elders, financial independence, peers, teachers, educational curriculum. I'm going to go into that a little bit more later on. Mentors, other adults in the communities. These are all sources for these type of socialization. I wanted to mention 3 studies, just very briefly, about cultural socialization and its impact on psychological outcomes with Native Americans. This is a study by Yasui and colleagues in 2015, and in which they surveyed they surveyed the youth and also observed families in interactions with those youth in this particular study. There were 92 Native youth and their parents. And they found that higher levels of observed parental cultural socialization and socialization of coping with discrimination were positively associated with ethnic youth identity. This one is a longitudinal study of 137 Navajo adolescents at time 1, and 92 remained in the study 2 years later at time 2. And they're looking at the effects of ethnic identity and experiences of discrimination on psychosocial adjustment of Navajo adolescents. And at time 1, ethnic identity and bicultural orientation demonstrated a strong and positive relationship with adaptive functioning for both male and female. So, nice results. But then 2 years later, there were these results in terms of ethnic identity were not as significant as they had been, but discrimination experiences were considered to be most consistently a correlate of poor psychosocial functioning for the males. So the impact of this discrimination was very, it remained in 2 years later for the males. I listed out here in my notes to be able to read to you, but maybe you're reading them now, the different items on the perceived discrimination scale, because these studies that do look at perceived discrimination pretty much use this combination of 7 items. And I think it's important if you just think about them. They came from focus groups. Dr. Yoder held focus groups in developing the scale for the Whitback project a number of years ago. And these are pretty common: being insulted or excluded by friends or peers, encounters with teachers who they felt didn't expect them to do well in school, being treated disrespectfully by business owners, followed in stores and that kind of thing, harassment from police, being suspected of wrongdoing by an adult, racial slurs, and of course then being physically harmed. So those are items on the perceived discrimination scale that were used in this particular study, and they were used in the next study, which is a study that I participated in along with Les Whitback and one of my graduate students, and Dan Hoyt. And in this study, we surveyed 222 Native early adolescents and their parents and their grandparents. We couldn't do a longitudinal study, so we tried to sample these 3 different generations to get this perspective. We used the discrimination scale that you just saw earlier in the last slide, and we were looking at what are the influences on resilience among our sample. And we had a number of measures, and basically what we found in a regression analysis is what predicts resilience in the sample, and was the higher levels of parental warmth, community support, enculturation, and here's where you get the cultural socialization. And we measured enculturation by cultural identification using the Edding and Bouvet scale, one of the scales that was used in the previous study, the degree to which the youth participated in traditional activities. And these were activities that are still going on in the community, but have remained from generations before them. and then also how important and how often the youth engaged in ceremonies. So we put this together in a construct that's called inculturation, which is really kind of the opposite of acculturation. Acculturation is when you are sort of acclimating to the mainstream, where inculturation is where you are engaged in cultural socialization practices. And we found that this was these things, parental warmth, community support, inculturation, were positively associated with youth resilience. And age, in terms of the older that the youth were, the less resilient that they were, and perceived discrimination were negatively associated with resilience. So, I want to go now to some kind of these 4 areas that Diane used when she wrote her extensive literature review that was in child development about racial ethnic socialization. She categorized a lot of the studies into these different types of racial ethnic socialization: preparation for bias, promotion of mistrust, silence about race, and egalitarianism. So of the studies, that was Diane Hughes. And then Dr. Umana Taylor has recently, just this year, published kind of an update of that work. And in her update of all the studies on parents' racial ethnic socialization up to today in 2020, 69 studies focused on preparation for bias and anticipating that there will be bias. And these findings suggested the association between preparation for bias and youth adjustment, and also that it was context dependent. And they're saying that apart from what parents believe about their culture, they may still need to prepare their children to interpret, understand, and deflect bias. And I would highly recommend Jennifer Eberhardt's book that's titled exactly that, Bias. It's outstanding, and it's recent as of I think last year, and it's a wonderful book if anybody's interested in going into this much further. Another type is promotion of mistrust. And so out of within this current lit review, 31 studies emphasize promotion of mistrust. And out of those, 80% found it was linked with adjustment, 28% didn't find any association, null findings, 4% found it promoted positive outcomes, all right, and 40% found that it was associated with risk, that it may promote negative outcomes for youth adjustment or greater depressive symptoms. In promotion for mistrust, it's that it's emphasizing kind of a wariness for interracial interactions, and I think what we found is that might be okay, but it's just kind of like a consciousness raising about being careful, but it's not helping people understand how to manage that or how to, cope with it. It's sort of an alerting of things. And it is associated with negative outcomes. I think it's important, since even though we're talking about family and parental racial socialization, that actually, schools are unfortunately sometimes guilty of shaping mistrust in others. And the way that can be done is through tracking. Everybody knows what track they're in, if in fact they are in different tracks. Special education programs, even just the way that students tend to socially distance themselves in terms of affiliation groups, or Beverly Tatum's book, Why Are the Black Kids Still Sitting Together in the School's Cafeteria, those kinds of things. Or when my daughter was in high school, there was one door that a lot of the kids of color went in, and the other door that the white kids went in, and that sort of found its way up through the different floors in the school. Was very interesting, and whether schools facilitate or encourage that is something that could be the question. Okay, I want to go. I think I backed up here. Okay. This is an interesting book. If anyone ever has the time, one of my favorite books about silence and socialization. This is No No Boy by John Okada, a wonderful book. But basically, it's about a boy, a young man, who refused to serve in the war, a Japanese American guy who refused to serve, and then you know, how that affected his identity throughout, what it was like when he got out of jail, or because he had to serve time. He was incarcerated because he wouldn't serve in the service. And but anyway, it's about the power of silence. I think it's important for us to remember that we do socialize youth about race even when we're silent about it. It still communicates some kinds of values. Some cultures emphasize the suppression of emotion and restraint in order to keep harmony within the group, so that some of that's cultural. We don't have any data yet that's published that I know of on this topic with Native American parents in terms of being associated with racial socialization. But it's interesting that Diane Hughes did find that when she asked parents open-ended questions about strategies that they use for racial ethnic socialization, 20 to 50% of the parents said that they did nothing. Another type is, the final type is egalitarianism. And this is where parents encourage their children to value individual qualities over racial group membership, or to avoid any mention of race in discussions about that with their children. And Hughes talked about how many African Americans emphasize hard work, virtue, self-acceptance, and equality as examples of ethnic racial socialization. And that a lot of the white parents that she interviewed promoted colorblindness. I think people are thinking now that this is not very...
So I'm muted.
Yeah,
Pardon?
you're muted, but if you want to turn her down, you can go over here.
Oh, could everybody
I
mute
don't think
themselves?
my up down works. It's that one.
I'll try to mute.
I want to hear it though, so keep it up.
Oh, God. Okay.
What's happening?
All right, are we good? I think I got it. You ready?
Are we going back, or should I keep going?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, all right, thank you. Okay. I think Umana Taylor is emphasizing the fact now that this is the least empirically studied type of socialization, and that it is a really important area to research because of issues of hierarchy and social positioning, and that if parents encourage their children to think only individually and not so much at the social hierarchy, that we may be sort of naively positioning them to get hurt. And so we need to know, how to manage that within the realm of also looking at critical consciousness and being able to assess that hierarchy. But that's just some forewarning for where we need to be in a more advanced stage than we were when this earlier work was presented by Hughes. I'm going to skip the next few slides because I feel like I can go over this if we have time, but I would like to go on because I'd like for it to be able to get into questions and answers in a little bit. All right. Does anybody have any questions at this point? Because we're going to start switching now into school racial socialization.
So if you want to put the questions in the chat, I could ask them. I guess I had one question, and that was about your reference to the flower dance and Dr. Risling Baldy's work. And
Mhm.
just wanted to see if you could unpack it a little bit more of the sort of how that's connected to some of this racial, ethnic sort of socialization work and some of the research that is coming out, that has came out about the importance of cultural identity, racial socialization, ethnic socialization, and just connecting with the flower dance and your reference to that. Because I think for our community, that's very important, or it's, you know, on top of the mind of many people, the flower dance and other cultural practices. So if you could just talk a little bit more about the link between those two.
Mhm. I will. Let me just go back for the picture while we're at it, since I like it so much. Oh, here, maybe yes. And then we also have the ones of, in the corner on my notes, so we can think about that collectively. Well, first of all, one of the reasons that, one I want to say is an incredible work of scholarship, but more importantly, what's happening here is cultural revitalization, and there's a lot of knowledge in preparation for a girl going through one of these ceremonies. There's a lot of community engagement around planning and preparing for it, for it, working with her to gain knowledge about what this is all about, having probably events in order to get everything together for families that needed to, build, or do construction on the ceremonial site. That's, I mean, it's a very empowering thing to think that all these people are gathering, to share with the girl her, coming of age. And so many people then attend. But and I can just speak more directly. I mean, I was fortunate enough, thanks to Virgil and to Katja, to be able to attend one of these ceremonies summer before last. But I can talk specifically about my own daughter's naming ceremony and my granddaughter's naming ceremony that happened a couple years ago, and it's amazing. I think what it does is it really sets aside a demand, an event that's coming up that everyone is planning for, and that time is taken really to help this young person be educated about what's important culturally, and why do we do some of the things we do, and what is important about being a contributing member in this community through coming up, as you come of age. It's it really is, it just signifies your belongingness, and the importance of your belongingness, and your potential future contributions, and how you need to live a good life in order to be a contributing member to the community. And that's what I saw happening, in the experience that I had, thankfully, in being able to attend the flower dance up, in the Hoopa Valley when I was there. Is that what you're talking about,
Yeah,
Virgil?
and I guess I was just thinking, like, this racial socialization and ethnic sort of socialization, how important it is to the thriving of Native American youth. And really, if we're thinking about like schools, how does the schools contribute to helping Native youth learn about who they are as a Native person, whether it's working with the local tribes or whether it's doing trainings like this, but how important this sort of process is to the mental health and wellness of so many of our youth, and that the best research in the nation is backing that up.
Well, it's essential if you want to have, if you want to encourage academic achievement, academic engagement. I mean, if a person feels so much stronger about their identity and their self-esteem, they're going to be much more motivated to continue to go on and to be engaged in school and to become that contributing member that of whatever kind within the community. So it's just all, I see it as all additive in a very, or exponential in a very, very important way. I think I'm going to try to move to the part about school now, if that's okay. Because I think we're going to get there. All right. I think it's even, it's here in some ways. I mean, so, in this case, even just in these slides, these are typical, school scenes, but in the lower one at the bottom, this is a native flute class. And that again is reinforcing that some of what is going on traditionally is very important, and we're going to bring, and it's important in our own setting, and encouraging what is going on in terms of what we value, and bringing a real seriousness to the work. I was fortunate a few years ago, the American Indian Life Skills was used in the Indian Family Children's Services in Oakland. It was an after-school program, and it was just interesting to see how smudging before the students started their group or they started doing their homework just centered everybody and got everyone kind of serious. And they went on, with what the purpose of the after-school program was, and it was just amazing how that just moved everything into more of a focused direction in what they were doing. So many different things like that. Chief Leshai School in Tacoma, starting with an honor, a drum in the morning, and a convocation where all the students just are out around the drum before classes begin. Again, setting the stage for the seriousness of why we're in school and what we're doing. These are some of the school practices around race and ethnicity and how they shape racial and ethnic identity. Obviously, who is on the school staff matters. Who are, the students' peers, but also who represents them in the teaching staff and the administration staff or other school staff. I think that sends a message. What kind of contact do they have, and what prejudice reduction, and I'm going to go on into that in a little bit with the work of Howard Stevenson. If racial discrimination is tolerated. It was interesting, a few years ago, I was in Utah, and a Navajo student was telling me about how in some of the schools there, the attendance is taken, and the students who are Mormon are alphabetically listed. And when they take attendance, they always take attendance, by calling off alphabetically those names first, and then they have a second set of names that are alphabetically listed. But those are the students that are not Mormon. I mean, and it could be, blue-eyed or green-eyed kids. It's any ways in which people are discriminated, or there's an emphasis placed on difference that is not necessarily in a that means a little bit of exclusion or differential treatment. Multicultural education is great, but how much does it help whenever attention to inequities are ignored? The work on, the exciting work that's being done on culturally relevant, culturally sustaining pedagogy, again, same kind of thing. It's wonderful, but do we need to look also at structural inequalities at the time? Or we can just look at, what they talk about as the hidden curriculum, and how that conveys certain things in terms of the policies and different types of decisions that are made about, in terms of the structure of the school. So these are, people who are doing work on school racial socialization are beginning to spend more time on these kinds of issues. Anyway, in a lot of this work, we do see that it is very impactful in terms of academic outcomes. And in 2006, shared that ethnic racial socialization contain messages about opportunities that influence youth perceptions of opportunities and their investment in the academic domain. So let's say if I think, say I come from, a family that isn't, I'm first generation in terms of a college student. And so I don't have anyone in my family that's gone on to college. But through going over some of the historical scholars, I'm projecting to what Diane Hughes might have been talking about, different African-American inventors and scholars and teachers and all this, I can maybe begin to see myself in that, where I wouldn't if those models were not presented in some ways. I think it's very important to prepare people for bias so that whenever it happens, we understand what stereotypes are, we understand how this thing works. And it isn't so much a person internalizes it, it's something that they've done that causes them to be discriminated against in that way, or overlooked in that way, or that kind of thing. And then also I think that that is very helpful in terms of the goals. Let's just go back to the flower dance. Many of the young girls that are of that age could, in interacting with people who have helped revive this ceremony, are meeting outstanding educators and beginning to understand them as people, as aunties and elders that they can relate to, not just those people who are like the superintendent of schools or the science teacher or the professor over at Humboldt State and that kind of thing. They see that we all do here, belong together. In terms of psychological outcomes, they, in Hughes's article, she talked a lot about how ethnic racial socialization was associated with fewer behavior problems and fewer internalizing and externally behavioral problems for boys. But it wasn't so much associated with internalizing problems or externally internalizing problems for girls. So it seemed to be way more effective for boys than girls. The other thing is that I think that the type of socialization might be different for boys and girls. Boys experience a lot more discrimination than girls, and in a way, girls are rewarded for their increased knowledge of culture and pride, and more ethnic pride kinds of things than happen to be as fearful about, but then that's very gendered, and I don't like what I'm saying, because people, girls and boys both need to have the talk around the kinds of things that they may potentially experience. But in these psychological studies, that's what they found. I wanted to move on now to the work of Howard Stevenson. Sorry. I've always been fascinated with his work because he was somehow able to take this research on racial ethnic socialization, bring it into schools, and find a way to relate it to helping people be more fluent in handling these kinds of issues. He's at the University of Pennsylvania. This is one of his books. And for the educators that are in our webinar today, I highly recommend this book. So Dr. Stevenson mentions strategies that so in a way, we shouldn't only think about working with racial ethnic socialization in schools with the students, but I think we need to think about it in terms of the educators and the administrators, all of us as adults, in terms of, you know, how we get away from just avoiding racially loaded situations that happen. And it seems like the norm is to just kind of try to ignore it. So he goes through this process of talking about different strategies, and he mentions how storytelling is really, you know, quite effective, because in the process of telling one story about a racial encounter or something that happens, a person's able to get a release of emotions, and maybe not even have to be as precise about the accuracy of what they're saying, but talking more about the impact that it had on the person. But then he's recommends that after that, a person should go into journaling, because they need to really reflect deeply about the various things that happened in the encounter. And as they're doing that, they may be able to think, well, if I had a chance to do that over again, I would have handled it this way or that way. But he's really helping people say, these things are going to occur throughout life, and we need to be able to know how to have comebacks and how to handle it, so that people don't just like walk away and feel devastated or become so angry that it really exacerbates the situation and makes it worse. And then he really emphasizes the importance of learning. It's like mindfulness, learning how to relax in the moment when a racial tension is going on, in order to be able to be as effective as possible. And then he has, you know, I've seen a video of him with adolescent youth, where they had a weekly class, or it could even be that the class is in the school and it's based on an as need basis. When students have had a racial encounter, that they get together as a group and they dissect it, and they talk about, you know, how it was handled and what were the positives and negatives of the way it was handled, how would they handle it and improve it more, practice that, etc., so that they get better at negotiating these things and the practice. So that's something about the strategies. But he's basically saying that it's important to develop skills around this, cognitive, behavioral, and emotional intelligence skill sets. And, you know, some of it is perspective taking, some of it's being able to kind of, I guess you would say, dialogue and practice with this, and also to be able to get to think about, you know, it isn't always either or. There doesn't have to be a winner. There can be both and ways of looking at things. And, you know, but the important part is that the person really is engaged with it and handles it, rather than feels inferior because they didn't handle it well. And so he has what he calls Can We Talk? CWT. And I after reading about it, I have kind of determined that what I would think the mediating factors are the fact that he teaches a lot about self-regulation, how to handle emotions, and how to know how to, you know, respond, and when to respond, and the timing of it, and who the target person is, and all that kind of thing, and racial assertiveness. And he says that the core skills for racial literacy are mindfulness and stress management, talking about feelings and nonverbal communication, basically being able to assess the situation as a strong communicator, and then also assertiveness training to be able to say appropriately what the issues are and be able to stand up for oneself in the situation. And the reason I guess I like it so much is that it's really focused on a kind of skill emphasis, like, you know, what I have done with in developing American Indian life skills. And so this is a curriculum that is used in a lot of schools where only Native students are, and public schools, tribal schools, charter schools, BIE schools, alternative schools. It's been used in group homes. It's been used in hospitals, etc. But it is a skill focus. And when we were asked to do this through the Pueblo Zuni, to develop a suicide prevention curriculum for the schools, we decided that it was important to look at all the different kinds of behaviors and expectations that lead up to a person feeling that they would be, need to harm themselves or in their life as kind of like the ultimate of being unhappy. And better to focus on the skills rather than so much on only the end stage behavior. And so we're hoping these skills will prevent a person from feeling that way. So the logic model for American Indian life skills is something like this. It's very much a stress coping model. And it looks at a number of different risk factors. I have, in this model, I've just outlined a few, but here's some common ones: racial stress, historical trauma, pervasive poverty, hard poverty. That's the ecological factors, the things that are in the air, so to speak, they're ever present. Then we have, social factors like community violence or family disruption and interpersonal problems, or, those kinds of things. I'm not saying that these are all happenings. I'm saying that risk factors occur, some constellation of these risk factors are there. And then the individual factors we often think about are depression, substance abuse, psychological disorder. I added age and gender in there because those are individual characteristics that are unique for different ages and genders in terms of suicide prevention. So you've got this backdrop of some risk, a stressful event happens, and people often either approach it and try to handle it, or they flee and try to avoid it. And it seems as if in the work that I've done, a lot of the pathway to suicide is avoiding it and not dealing with it, self-medicating, continuing to feel negative and not thinking, a lot, and which could lead to suicide. The AILS, and in a way you could say, Can We Talk, of Stevenson's, is a type of intervention that's trying to really reinforce approach coping. And in the case of AILS, it's really, again, trying to enforce effective problem solving and positive thinking, which we think leads to resilience and resilient adaptation. You could almost put in here, Can We Talk is in enforcing, really teaching approach coping, which could, lead to feeling and resolving different types of racial tensions that occur in a person's life and encounters, which can lead to, definitely it leads to academic achievement, it leads to psychological well-being, and all those, a number of different other kinds of outcomes. Now, these are the different sections of American Indian life skills. And as you can see, there's 7 sections, and I think all told, there are 44 different lessons. So several, there are a number of lessons within each of these sections. And we basically began with building self-esteem, a number of lessons on that. And then we moved to emotions and stress. And then we moved to communication skills and problem solving skills. And then we had to add this section 4 on self-destructive behavior, because in the beginnings of our development of the curriculum, we would hear students kind of talking like, well, maybe because we're Native, we're suicidal. And that just couldn't be. And what we tried to do is to get at what, why might there be reasons that people would feel self-destructive. And so that gets into some of historical trauma and what is a dysfunctional family, when is, there's a section in there about, decisions about when is the appropriate have, engage in sexual activity, and, these different kinds of the sections just kind of as the backdrop about, well, why might some of this happen, and do we need to do it, and that kind of thing. But the point I'm trying to get to with 5 and 6, this is when we finally get to a suicide prevention, kind of the classic crisis intervention around suicide. And that is information about suicide and learning how to help a suicidal friend get to a trusted adult. And then we didn't want to end the curriculum there. And therefore we have the section 7, which is a number of great lessons. I think there are about 8 in that section, about planning ahead for the future. And so it's very upbeat. It ends in a very positive note. So it's about individual and community goal setting. And so, people have often asked me, well, what's cultural about this? It looks like strict cognitive behavioral work. And so I want to say that it's cultural in that the scenarios and the information giving that's there for the teachers or interventionists includes a lot of indigenous knowledge. And we're trying to emphasize positive cultural teachings. And we also do use, metaphors that relate to pretty much a lot to reservation life, but also to life in Native communities. So, aside from those 7 sections, these are the skills that are emphasized in American Indian Life Skills. And as I mentioned, I think that the key active ingredients are positive thinking and effective problem solving. And so, does it work? This is the first study of the effectiveness of the Zuni life skills, because it was called Zuni life skills at first because it was developed and evaluated with the Pueblo of Zuni, and they've allowed me to acknowledge the community, and also later on when we developed examples from other tribes to rename it American Indian Life Skills. But basically what we found is that the students that were engaged in the curriculum versus those in classes that didn't receive the curriculum at the same time were significantly less hopeless and significantly more confident in their ability to manage anger. And in a behavioral role play where they had suicide intervention skills tested with an indirect mention of suicide and a direct mention of suicide, two suicide scenarios and 2 problem-solving scenarios, they were significantly more effective. And those were role plays that were videotaped and randomized and rated by Native American raters. And we did find these outcomes, which were very good. And I do want to say that at the time that we did the study, 40% of the youth in the study had, and there were 101 freshmen, 27 juniors, had a relative or friend who had died by suicide. And 18% of them reported that they themselves had attempted suicide. This is another study that we can't really attribute only to American Indian Life Skills, because it was part of a comprehensive suicide prevention program that included natural helpers in housing areas. They improved the surveillance of where the activity was going in the community. This was in a community in the Southwest. They improved their screening. They did screenings at powwows and different events, community events, as well as in the clinic and the school and different programs. And then they also did use American Indian Life Skills in the school. But what you see is they did this in the late 80s, and then they reported it out in about 2003. And what you see is, in terms of the number of attempts, a very significant change in the orange line that's going across in terms of drops in attempts from 40 in the 80s to in 2000, maybe 10. in terms of suicidal gestures from 30 in the late 80s to maybe 8 or 9 in 2000. And but you'll see also at the bottom that the actual deaths by suicide did not change significantly over time. So it did improve suicidal behavior in terms of gestures and ideation. And then this one is a study, it's an independent study that was done by an outside group. I had nothing to do with it. And these are 90 high school students in the Southwest, in northern New Mexico. And what they did is that they gave only 10 lessons of AILS over a year's time in 5 different high schools. And there's what they found is, this is a pre-post, there was not a comparison group, but they found that those that they found decreases in hopelessness and suicidal risks and increases in public collective esteem, which is an identity measure. It's how do I think other people are, the public or other groups view my own group. And then self-efficacy is confidence, and self-awareness, we know what that is. So anyway, good results. And then since then, I have developed a middle school version, early adolescent version. And we did do an evaluation. We were able to randomize that this time, going back to Zuni some 20 years later with the middle school version, and we found that we found good outcomes in terms of increases in self-efficacy to manage depression and cope with stress and enlist community support and enlist social resources as a result of this curriculum. So I'm kind of getting aware of time, and I just have just a couple more slides, and I'll be glad to open this up for questions. I think what I see here, this is back to Howard Stevens's book and his work with Can We Talk? And these are what he thinks are the core skills for racial literacy, which is mindfulness and stress management, talking about feelings and nonverbal communication, and assertiveness training. I've highlighted the words mindfulness and assertiveness training because American Indian Life Skills does these other things. We have lessons on recognizing stress and learning how to manage stress. We have a lot of lessons on feeling talk and lessons on analyzing nonverbal behavior and why that's important. It's not hard to develop something on assertiveness training, but basically it's somewhat aligned with the work of American Indian Life Skills, where we already have the ones that are highlighted here. These ones that are highlighted are what Howard Stevenson is talking about. The only difference is that with American Indian Life Skills, we weren't focusing at that time on issues about racial inequalities and racial encounters and bias and that kind of thing, because that wasn't what the Pueblo of Zuni was concerned about, because they were not focusing on that in their daily life at that point in time. At least they weren't asking me to deal with it, and they didn't see that as being associated with suicide in their community at the time. But I think it would be very interesting to try to bring the missing skills, the missing elements, so to speak, of Stevenson's into American Indian Life Skills with the scenarios that are relevant, more relevant to youth today, that are focusing on this anti-Black racism and that are becoming more critically aware of how to negotiate diversity, because the country is, the populations within our country are so much more ethnically diverse. And I think that'd be very great. So my takeaways with this are this: that schools are often overlooked as sites for mental health prevention, that school-based prevention interventions such as AILS and Can We Talk have shown positive outcomes, that there are approaches to school involvement and community-wide change in suicide prevention with American Indians, and they are increasing. There are more. People always ask me, well, what about families with suicide prevention? And what about more community-wide work? There's a lot of really wonderful community work in suicide prevention in Indian communities, but they haven't been the reason they haven't been studied, and hopefully more people will be evaluating it, or I don't like that word evaluate, but they are being analyzed for their effectiveness. And then also that approaches to school involvement and community-wide development in prejudice reduction and racial literacy with American Indians does not exist, and hopefully it's going to be just beginning. So that's the story that I would like to tell today.
Thank you. So maybe we have some questions, and you kind of touched on it right there, at least I think you did, but one of the questions is from Maxine, and she said that I noticed that you mentioned African Americans. This is in more the middle part of your presentation. When she asked this, you mentioning African Americans, not Indigenous or Native youth. Is there reasoning behind this, or am I misunderstanding something? African American was mentioned. I want to be mindful of my speech as well. How do the youth like to be recognized? So I think just the mentioning of African Americans, and then maybe a little bit of the reasons behind that sort of comparison.
Okay, thank you. Well, I should have said it. The reason that I, have used so much material related to African Americans is because that's where this work on racial socialization began. And I think that African Americans do experience more racism than other ethnic groups, than Latinos, Asian Americans, Native Americans. I think that's pretty much been. If you look at, and it's hard, or maybe it's just because there's more research done. But basically, if you look at the recent studies on health disparities and the life expectancy of African Americans and that. But basically the reason that I did is because that literature existed. And that's where this racial socialization work began. And that was like 20 years ago, okay? And now what we have is, fortunately, like the last time we talked, I talked about Joe Gaughan's work and Stephanie Freiberg's work, and that people are doing research on Native American identity. And then I presented 3 studies today on Native American cultural socialization and its impact on psychological well-being, and its impact on kind of recoiling from perceived discrimination. And so I didn't mean, what I'm trying to bring us to the point that we now are beginning to have to have studies on this, and we now have more knowledge. But the cultural socialization practices have been going on for generations. And what I was trying to do was to say, this is here. It's just that we're not studying ceremonies and we're not studying those practices, okay? But it happens, and that's one of the forms of, of its cultural and ethnic socialization, really. So I hope that answered that question.
Yeah, I guess for a little bit more clarity, is the similarities or the differences between cultural socialization and sort of the racial ethnic socialization, like being able to I'm just trying to get my mind around that, and maybe that's where part of this question is coming from.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think for African Americans, I think the big issue is more biological, what a person looks like in terms of, and certainly in the area of racial ethnic identity, that was, that's what is said, okay, in terms of what a person looks like, in terms of skin color, hair texture, facial structure, and they can look at all different grade, degrees of these characteristics. And so it's more about phenotype, and it's more about how people react to the physical characteristics of an African American person. Okay.
Can I say something?
Yes.
I'm a mother of of 3 African American children. And it is cultural also, because since they were brought over long, long ago, Africa doesn't really count them as African American. So they don't want them part of their culture. So African Americans that are here in the United States don't really have their own culture because they are not seen as Africans from Africa anymore.
Thank you, Mary Beth. I think I think they have a culture. They definitely have. Everyone has a culture, and the culture is a different culture than the African continent. The cultures on the African continent. Okay, and I think that for Native Americans, yes, race is going to be a part of it in terms of colorism, what's happened historically, but I think it moves into more what's happened historically and politically, and the definite desire for cultural preservation and maintaining culture. And I think that that they're and also kind of fighting off invisibility. Okay, I think that's certainly a slight that a lot of people struggle with, being overlooked or being mistaken for another Filipino or Latino, etc. And so but I don't think it gets so much. I mean, at least in the kinds of things that people study related to Native American identity, it pretty much always goes back to discrimination and engagement in culture. Did I answer your question? I don't know. I don't really mean to compare the two. I'm trying to bring, though, these 3 sets of information: racial socialization, ethnic socialization, which, that could be, there are a lot of different ethnic groups in the US. And so, and I think that searching and understanding, your family background and your sense of belongingness, that's what Jean Finney would talk about in terms of her work. That's one thing. But then there's also, it seems like with Native Americans, most of the attention is on cultural socialization. What do people think about this idea that it could be skills-based to help youth think about how to negotiate these issues? It seems to me that when people begin to negotiate the issues is when they go off to the service or go away to college, if they're if they're still living in their communities, in reservation communities. Now, in urban areas, that's different because people are, in very diverse settings, and that kind of stuff is, sort of negotiated a lot of the time.
You know what I'm thinking, this is Verla from the Wellness Center, is when I left here when I was 6 years old from Hoopa Reservation, and my dad was in the military, I went down to Fairfield. And down there was so many multiple nationalities. I did not know until I got older how there were so many prejudice, whether it was African Americans or whatever, because the friends that I grew up with and the schools I went to, we all interacted with every nationality, and all of us were friends. But at the same time, my parents made sure that we would come up here for the summers, for the dances. I would learn my culture. I would go to Nevada and learn that part too. And so that to me was really important because I was hung with my elders and stuff. So I think it's, if us as parents can get our kids into, you know, our religions, whether it be African American, whether it be Native American or whatever. That helps us a lot, I think, to understand and not just, you know, like my kids are half Basque. So, you know, but they were brought up with their Hoopa culture, you know, and maybe one day they'll learn their Basque. I'm not sure, but I think it's up to us to teach our children our nationalities. And like the one who mentioned her kids being half Black or Black, and my nephews and nieces, they're Black and Native American, but they were brought here, and so they know it. They don't follow it, but they do know it. They know how to respect it and what to do and what not to do. So that's their choice of, you know, what they want. And she's right, you know. Mine are my nephews and nieces are on the darker side, but you know that they can't tell they're Native American. My kids, one of them because of dark hair looks Native American. The other one, you cannot tell she's my child, you know, but she is, you know. So I think that I love that my parents taught me to not be racial, taught me to respect all religions, and then they also taught me my Native American culture. So, you know, and it's hard. It's hard for some people. I see when I came back, it's hard because a lot of them have never associated with other nationalities and not understanding that. So anyway, I just wanted to mention that.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. What happens in schools? I mean, is there much interethnic tension in the schools? See, Howard Hughes would say most schools try to ignore it and they don't want to deal with it, but it is really there. And I think it is. I mean, I do think it is. I think that I think youth are really, actually one of my students a few years ago who was biracial, she was African American and Italian. And then her son, she did her dissertation on biracial identity. And she was looking at what do schools do to kind of help this, you know, foster this awareness of you know, racial identity. What do schools do? And this was 10, 15 years ago. And she wanted to go to like Berkeley High because, you know, it's very ethnically diverse and all that, and study that. And of course, she couldn't get there. She's from Vallejo, and she tried to, and she knew that there were a lot of biracial students and biracial couples in Vallejo. And she started to try to get into the school in the community where she's from. And people right away, they didn't even want to keep racial counts. And they felt like she was trying to study something that might cause, like indirectly being, you know, accusing the school of racism. And she wasn't at all. She just wanted to study, you know, what do the schools do to foster or not this kind of awareness. And so she ended up having to go with a computer study, basically an online study, because she couldn't get a school that would help her with it, you know, because they didn't want to deal with it. And it was very interesting because the students felt very, you know, they're very conversant about their own fluidity and how, you know, they may have be like your children having biracial backgrounds, and they, you know, went in and out of their identity depending upon, you know, in terms of awareness, concern about it, mannerisms and everything else, depending upon, you know, what group of friends they were with, or whether they were at home versus whether they were at school, or, you know, all that kind of thing. And so, yeah.
So I see, thank you, Teresa. I see we have a question from Christina.
Hi, yeah, my name is Miss Tina West. I teach third grade at Hoopa Elementary School, and I just wanted to respond to you. I appreciate your talk, and I wanted to give you some feedback about, you were asking about like our racial tensions and such that are in our schools. Because we're public school on an Indian reservation, we have the majority of our students are American Indian. We have about 85 to 90% of our population are American Indian. So there's a huge sense of cultural community and cultural cohesion. And I think anybody who's taught in a community, an urban community or an area where there's racial tension can really attest to the harmony that's here. And also because we have such a small school, our kids went to preschool together. They're, going to the same class all the way through. So there is quite a bit of cultural cohesion and a sense of pride, and, everyone going to our Hoopa language classes or taking on our cultural identity. So I think that's really strong. But having said that, there are the cultural minority here tends to be European Americans or white people. And so there can be some racial, cracker comments or comments around racial tension in that regard. But I've noticed that even students who are biracial, including myself, who maybe phenotypically present as European American, they still culturally identify as Indigenous and have cultural values around the things that we value here in our community. So I think we're really fortunate in that way. And I know that because of the larger national conversation around race, there has been I would say there has been a small push for people to do some self-reflection as teachers, and what can we do to bring anti-racism curriculum to the forefront, and to give what you were talking about, skills, like giving kids the vocabulary to talk about race and the discomfort that comes up from that sometimes, and push through and have courageous conversations. So thanks for giving us some more information and dialogue around this.
Well, thank you. Thanks for your comments. I really appreciate it. Maybe you'll find some of those references, interesting if you ever have time. I'm sure as a teacher, you're very busy with what you're doing, but hopefully it'll be helpful. Thank you. Let's see here. Someone is talking about lateral oppression. Let me see if I'll look in the chat here to get to that one.
Yeah, I was bringing up lateral oppression as it pertains to the Hoopa Valley and what happens when schools are predominantly predominantly Native and on a reservation. So for instance, even as an adult living in Hoopa, there is that community cohesion, but there are other historical contexts that come into play, right? And so I get called derogatory names even as an adult, being Yurok and being a member of the community. And so what does that feel like for those kids in that school system who are participating and also receiving that feedback? Just to give some context.
Yes, thank you. I also think that, just as you were mentioning, it's also interesting in communities in a way like that the children are representing families, and families have histories with one another, and so there can even be just, they themselves may not be doing anything that would cause the oppression to happen, but it still visits them every now and then because of the history of whatever feuds or things that have happened that are that cause people to carry grudges and things like that. So yes, but you see, this is what I think. I will say, and I can just give you an example in the School of Education where I am at Stanford. The student body is much more culturally, ethnically, racially diverse among the graduate students than years past. I've been there for many, many years. And the faculty turn over more slowly. And so, and of course, there's the movement among students about who's teaching us. And it's interesting because they have the Spark Lab within the psychology department that's really dealing with these issues for educators. And we in a faculty meeting the other day, we were put into one of these groups. what do you call them? I forget now, on Zoom, chat rooms with randomly with different faculty. And we had problems to have to deal with. And it was very interesting, you know, knowing people and the kinds of things that came out. And so here we are, you know, trying to all be fairly good at, you know, as good as we can be, and social justice oriented, and, you know, interpersonally among colleagues, things, you know, there was some tension around, you know, this case study that we're working on, which really amounted to, it was about somebody using this internet technology and randomly assigning people to groups, and then they didn't like the composition of the way that the groups formed, and then took some students out into another group, and some students self-selected out, and then it became very racially, you know, clustered, and then how they handled it, and, you know, just things like that. I thought I found it, you know, to be very interesting that this is all delicate. It's delicate because it's not just the problem of the case study that we were looking at, it's the histories of many of us that have been there and know each other fairly well and that kind of thing.
You know, I understand what Shoshoni's saying, because when I moved back here in '88, I would hear people make remarks like, you know, from, you know, oh, they're from, you know, whether they're Yurok, Shoshone, or not Shoshone, sorry, that's me, Yurok or Karuk or whatever. And it confused me back then, and to this day I don't use it. As far as I'm concerned, we're all Native Americans, or, you know, whether we're half, quarter, descendant, and it's the respect you show it. You shouldn't have a name for us. I mean, we're Native Americans and we should all stick together. That's my personal opinion.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
And I'd like to share that, you know, spinning off Verla, that when I was young, I grew up in the city. And so I was immersed in the Mexican gang culture. And so, you know, my parents saw that. And so my dad lost his job and he said, well, let's move to Hoopa, because, you know, we moved back and forth between Hoopa and Arizona. But that's what I knew when I came back. When I moved to Hoopa, you know, it was a big cultural shock. So I went from city lights to city to dark, backwoods, you know, mountainous region. And so it was really a culture shock for me. And then, you know, it was like learning this other side, you know, the native side. And so growing up in the city, I wasn't exposed to that. But even growing up, you know, in the 70s, 80s, coming through, you know, the dances were going on, but it wasn't pushed or promoted like I see now. And, you know, nobody, you know, they have a couple of dance demonstrations through the school, and you kind of got to see that, but you kind of didn't, they had a group of kids that participated in that who danced, but, you know, that was the exposure back then. And it wasn't until like really just taking the courage to go down and start learning and doing this stuff. But it took courage to do that. But it wasn't pushed or promoted like it is now. And I contribute that to the people who have gone through, are native and go to school, and they're coming back and seeing the importance of that. And so, you know, I applaud those people for doing that. In a second sense is, you know, while I was growing up here, I did see the stuff that Verla was talking about, and I think that people had more of a connection to their own tribes, and you used to always see, like, you know, Hoopa rule, Yurok rule, you know, it was always a separation. But I'm not seeing that so much anymore, but I do know that it's still out there. I think in the 80s and 70s, I really saw a whole bunch of that, where it was, you know, your tribe just really ruled. And I think now it's more kind of coming together, kind of like what Verla's saying. I see everybody kind of being the same. And, you know, and that's how I look at natives is, you know, we're kind of the same, with the same kind of histories and the same kind of problems and the same kind of everything. And so, you know, for me coming back and moving here and, you know, looking at where I was and where I'm at now, you know, I think the people from ITEP really helped out, because, you know, I still remember this question. They said, you know, if if an alien comes down to Earth and they say, hi, how are you? Tell me who you are. And you say, well, I'm Aaron and I'm Indian. And they're saying, what is that? What does that mean? And basically it kind of challenges you to look at who you are. And, if you are saying you're Indian, well, what makes you Indian? What makes you separate from another group? And why, what are you doing? How are you practicing it? What are your thoughts? And basically it kind of just challenged you to look at, oh my goodness, what is it that makes me up to do that kind of stuff? So whatever culture or race you are, it's like, and this young man approached me one day, and he said, I knew him and he knew me, but he stopped me and said, who are you? And I'm like, I told him, and he says, you don't know yourself. And basically what he was saying or alluding to the fact was, I knew about this culture, but I didn't know about my other culture. Because I didn't know about that, he was saying, basically, you don't know, who you are. And that was a little bit of eye awakening for me, because yes, when we are saying we are from a group, we should know about that group or recognize and honor that group. So anyway, that's my 2 cents.
Thank you, Aaron. So I see we're at time. I want to thank Teresa. I want to thank all of you for coming, and we'll be sending the evaluation and more information on the third training in the email. We'll be sending it in the next hour. And again, thanks for tuning in, and I hope you have a good rest of your Wednesday. All right.
Thank you.